Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is complete. A night vision scope image showed Major General Chris Donahue, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, holding an M4 and boarding a C-17 Globemaster on Monday night. Donahue was the last American serviceman to step off the Afghanistan soil, bringing to an end a nearly 20-year war with the Taliban returning to power. On Monday night, the wheel came full circle on the U.S. invasion and subsequent occupation of Afghanistan. Within the U.S., opinion is divided on partisan lines about President Joe Biden's decision to leave. Republicans and even some Democrats argue that he should have extended the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. They blame the fall of Kabul and the abdication of Ashraf Ghani's government on Biden's decision to withdraw precipitously. Others praise Biden for sticking to his decision despite the political and reputational costs and point out that staying would not have altered the outcome. In that, by all discerning accounts, they are right. To quote Lakhdar Brahimi from a 2004 interview, the Bonn arrangement, which kept the Taliban out of the future political settlement, was the original sin. In fairness to Biden, even as Barack Obama's vice president, he argued for counterterrorism operations instead of the expanded agenda that had come to inform the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Whether that would have altered the ground situation is, of course, a moot point. This evening, we shall review the U.S. war in Afghanistan and try and get a balance sheet. For that, I am joined by Ambassador Omar Samad, a former Afghanistan ambassador to Canada and France, and advisor to Dr. Abdullah Abdullah. Adam Weinstein, a former U.S. Marine who served in Afghanistan, is now associated with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and Tariq Farhadi, a former Afghan government advisor. Thank you to the panelists. I think I couldn't have put together a better panel here for this discussion. But let me, since we're talking about a balance sheet of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, let me begin with Adam Weinstein here. Adam, give me your sense of how you'll have a quick review of the gains and losses.
Well, there were some U.S. gains. There was a degradation of al-Qaeda. The United States did improve the infrastructure and some of the health and education metrics of Afghanistan. But I think when we look at the gains, a lot of people try to look at them in a vacuum. You have to compare them to the losses. The losses were significant U.S. casualties, even far more significant Afghan casualties. The continuation of this war, or at least the status quo of it, relied on upwards of 10,000 Afghan security forces deaths per year, over 2,000 civilian deaths per year, several thousand civilian injuries per year, and billions of dollars. So I think when we look at the gains and we measure them against the losses, especially when we consider that these gains were only sustainable through a continuous U.S. military presence, then it becomes clear that it was a failed strategy. And we have to be willing to accept that. Because if we can't accept that the strategy failed, it really doesn't provide a foundation to imagine anything different going forward.
Right. Here's the question. This is not the first time. We saw this in Vietnam, although it wasn't a direct intervention, as in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, but there were lessons. And there was a lot of debate post-Vietnam about what went wrong and why, and so on. But then we see Afghanistan. And we also see a return of hubris in many ways. I mean, I can say that personally I saw it from close quarters in Washington, D.C. when I was at the Brookings Institution. And then I also saw the U.S. getting into Iraq on the basis of a number of assumptions that obviously time proved to be either wrong or, self-created. So is there going to be a lesson or lessons learned now, or are we going to witness a cycle of this again? I mean, some people are already saying, I can tell you that Leon Panetta in one of the interviews said, we'll most probably have to go back into Afghanistan.
Well, I think there is a lack of creativity in our foreign policy establishment, and many of them haven't learned any lessons. You're completely right about that. I think the American people have learned a lesson, and they simply don't think occupying countries makes sense, and that's who President Biden is speaking to. But unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., there's an incentive not to learn lessons. Look, a case in point of this is that when we had the ISKP attack at the gate of the airport, people were just calling on Biden to respond in some way, egging him on. Then we see this drone strike that ends up killing an Afghan family, and people criticize him for that. But the reality is, if he hadn't responded, they would have criticized him for not responding. People just aren't ready. The American foreign policy establishment is not ready to do real soul searching yet. The American people are. And I think what's going to matter going forward is, are politicians accountable to the American people, or are they accountable to the foreign policy establishment? For the last 20 years, the foreign policy establishment has had the benefit of a relatively detached population from foreign affairs. Social media and access to constant news and the ability to engage with what's going on in the world, I think, has changed that a bit. And so you're going to see politicians have to be a little bit more responsive to what actual Americans think.
Okay. Ambassador Samad, in addition to your diplomatic assignments, you were also an advisor to Dr. Abdullah Abdullah. I remember in 2011, on the sidelines of a Saban Center conference in D.C., I had the occasion of talking to Dr. Abdullah and trying to get a sense of where he thought Afghanistan was headed. One of the things that struck me, in addition to, a litany of all the mistakes that the U.S. and its allies were doing, Dr. Abdullah was very candid about one thing, and as I said, it's struck with me, it has stuck with me ever since. He said, we have also not been able to reach out to our own people. And at the end of the day, and it was quite prophetic, I must say, he said, at the end of the day, that is something that's likely to decide the direction that Afghanistan goes into.
Right. You talked to him at a time when he was out of office to begin with, and he was sort of getting ready to run for office. By 2014, he had tried it in 2009 and failed. I think Dr. Abdullah has always been involved in Afghanistan from an internal perspective. I mean, he was not in exile. He left Afghanistan under Soviet occupation and went back and joined the resistance with Ahmad Shah Massoud against the Soviets. And so he knows the country, or ought to know the country well, and its people, in its different dimensions. And I think he reflects that. Whereas Ashraf Ghani was away for a very long time and came back in 2002. And since tried to reconnect with Afghanistan, but I don't think, reconnected deeply, and he was still very much connected to his base in Washington. Going forward, I hope this helps those who are back in Afghanistan, still in Afghanistan, people such as Dr. Abdullah, Hamid Karzai, Hamid Gilani, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and many others. And even those who are outside of Afghanistan, who are stakeholders, political, social, community stakeholders, they have to have space, and they have to have a place in the Afghanistan that is about to be recreated. Now, in what image, we do not know. If the Taliban recreate an Afghanistan in their own image and do not reflect the diversity that the country represents, I think it will be a big mistake. And so it's important for these other stakeholders to play a role, to have a voice, and to be part of a new Afghanistan.
That's a very important point. But since we are, trying to have an assessment, a balance sheet of sorts, and Adam has been very candid about the mistakes that the United States has made, I would want you to give us a sense of where you think the Afghan partners might have gone wrong.
Let me just say that I think almost everyone involved in Afghanistan for the past 2 decades, even more than 2 decades, going back to the Russians, has made a lot of mistakes. Our neighbors have made a lot of mistakes, including Pakistan, Iran, and others, and not really understanding the country, its people, its culture, its way of life, even. And we have learned. Some of us have learned better than others, and I hope they put that to work. Now, the biggest factor are the Afghans. I agree with you. The Afghans, it's their country, it's their history, it's their culture, it's their society. And I come from a background where I remember in Afghanistan that was peaceful, in Afghanistan that was stable, in Afghanistan that, had a balanced approach towards foreign policy and domestic policy, and was starting to become a democracy of sorts, and allowed men and women to take part. So I remember that Afghanistan very well, an Afghanistan that connected East and West, and Afghanistan that obviously also had to play between the bipolar Cold War phenomena of the past, and did it somewhat well. But things changed from 1978 onward. And so Afghans have so many lessons to learn from the past 42 years. And I talk about it quite a bit. I point out to some of those mistakes on our part. And I think that the biggest problem that Afghans have had is that they have lacked organic grassroots leadership that belong to it, own their country. And we've always been a victim of either great power rivalries or regional rivalries, and I've had to contend with leadership that was weak and leadership that did not fully represent the country, and strategies imposed on us, and strategies that came from our own selves that did not reflect reality to a large extent. So I hope that we learn those lessons, and I hope that in the future, the Taliban and others can take stock of that.
I wrote this about, I think, 4 weeks ago. One of the things that which seem to have sort of, riled me always, there's this sort of triumphalism in certain quarters, even in Afghanistan, with reference to Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires. And my argument was that, this is patently nonsensical, because the worst sufferers in all these wars have been the Afghan people. Give me a sense of how, as I said, this triumphalism is also reflected in certain sections within Afghanistan. I want you to give me a sense of why that is so, because from where I stand, a peaceful Afghanistan, people, who are educated, who can contribute to their country, are far more important than any seeming sort of martial idea of fighting against everyone and sort of turning Afghanistan into a so-called graveyard of empires.
Well, I think it's an easy cliche to resort to and try to explain things. Obviously, there is a certain amount of reality attached to the fact that this landmass that today we call Afghanistan, and has been called Afghanistan for more than more or less 200 years, has been a crossroads of many conquerors and empires coming and going, or crossing through, going somewhere else. And some of them got bogged down, or some of them faced problems in this landmass that today is Afghanistan. Only the past 100 years, we have had three world powers: the British, the Russians, the Soviets, and now the Americans, who, for different reasons, under different circumstances and conditions, ended up in a quagmire in Afghanistan. But it's the Afghans, as you're right, it's the Afghan people who have paid the price. It has devastated this country. It has taken us back decades. As I told you, Afghanistan and its people inherently are a peaceful people. Yes, we've had issues, tribal issues at home, and infighting occasionally on water or land or anything like that. But overall, I remember a very peaceful country, and Afghans yearn for peace and stability and a return to normalcy. So what we need to do is create normalcy in the Afghan context, and that's the biggest challenge ahead.
Right. I tend to think that in these kinds of situations, when you have foreign occupying or invading force, when they might win the initial phases of the war, but when they get into stabilization operations, then that's where the actual problem begins. And that's not peculiar to Afghanistan. I mean, that happened in Vietnam, that happened in Iraq, it's happened in Somalia, elsewhere. I mean, there are a number of other examples. But let me pull in Mr. Farhadi here. Mr. Farhadi, I want to posit the same question to you with reference to, of course, there is, as I said, one can list a number of mistakes made by the U.S. and its allies. But I'm really interested in finding your views about where did the Afghan partners go wrong?
Well, yes, there's a lot of blame on Afghan partners. They accepted to be directed by the foreign countries. Now, they celebrated Afghanistan's independence every year, but in fact, Afghanistan was not independent. Aid which came to Afghanistan was not all managed by the Afghans. The part that was managed by the Afghans was misused. Democracy, when it arrived in Afghanistan, let's say after 2004 constitution, there were no political parties. So immediately elections took a tribal style. There were no political parties. Whether I agreed with somebody or not, I would just vote for the person who's from my tribe, because I knew that this way he would arrive at a power position and then I could be protected. So there was no philosophy of what we are voting for, because the philosophy was philosophy that's coming from the donor and who had the money, market economy, democracy, etc. But when the voting came in, political parties were not there, so there was 2 or 3 candidates from different ethnies of Afghanistan, and everyone pretty much voted for their ethnic. So this was not true democracy. There was no political party in Afghanistan, at least not a major party that included people from all the ethnies. Before every election, sort of people gravitated with the leaders of their own ethnic. And it divided Afghanistan. A division, yes, this division started really earlier in Afghanistan, but really this divided Afghanistan even more. That's why today there is no other leadership in Afghanistan. It's very hard to find other leaders, and Taliban have arrived again, this time in a vacuum. In a vacuum that the U.S. created by leaving, Taliban arrived to the office of the to the president's office without firing a bullet. They took over Kabul without firing a bullet. And now they are trying to govern. They're trying to govern. They just had a meeting in Kandahar, all Taliban. They didn't invite anybody else. They didn't invite anybody from Kabul or from other parts of Afghanistan or from other people who are not Taliban. There, the sense of exclusion starts. There, if the movement that Ahmad Massoud has started in Panjshir, which might have been a little premature, it takes some sense in my mind if the Taliban are gathering for 3 years in Kandahar for 3 days. They just finished a meeting of leadership 3 days in Kandahar. No one else was invited. They say they are going to come up with a government. No one else is really consulted. Yes, they have visited with President Karzai, Dr. Abdullah, but this is more for pictures and for charming the international community. If they come up with a government which is composed of Taliban only, yes, they have conquered military Afghanistan, but they are not going to conquer Afghanistan, the hearts and minds of people. Because we still need, after this conquest of the Taliban, we still need a discussion on how we want to be governed. Do we want to be governed by an emir and then the edicts and then all the positions of power by people we pretty much don't know because they have been fighting. Now we discover all these people with their turbans, and they look very impressive, but we don't know them. Should we let them govern us?
That's a very interesting thought. As a matter of fact, as ironies go, I think the Taliban now are in the same position as the U.S. and its allies. They are in control for the most part, except Panjshir and 2 or 3 districts in Baghlan. But now they have to stabilize, and by the looks of it, it seems that they're not doing a particularly good job of that. I was talking last week to Mr. Ahmad Wali Masood. We had arrived in Paris from Pakistan, and he was on my program, and I asked him about this transition council and this, talks between the Taliban and President Karzai and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Dr. Abdullah, and he was very clear. He said, look, this is not a framework for a political settlement, because it does not include all the stakeholders. So unless Taliban can come up with some kind of acceptable, political framework for political settlement, some kind of provisional government, all of this is not going anywhere. But Adam Weinstein, talking about eyes. So one of the things, and it's very clear from what Mr. Farhadi is saying, so one thing is about the centralization of, political power, which kind of went against historical trends also, ethnic tribal trends also. The other was creating an Afghan national defense and security forces also on centralized national lines and, frankly, along the lines of the U.S. military itself. Now, it seems to me that the U.S. military's way of operating is extremely complex in terms of planning, in terms of, gathering intelligence, in terms of logistics. For a very long time, the U.S. military also does not operate in the field without eyes in the sky. So the entire sort of ISTAR capabilities, if you will. So the moment those support systems were gone, in addition to other factors, which are many, ANDSF was inevitable for it to fold before the Taliban.
Well, I think that's 50% true. The United States created the ANDSF in its own image, and the U.S. military has had over 250 years to develop. The ANDSF had 20 years, and we expected them to use very sophisticated technology and maintain these static outposts that just didn't make sense when you're fighting an enemy like the Taliban. We should have created a ANDSF that was sustainable even without the United States. But I think it's also important that we need to remember at the end of the day, ANDSF didn't fight in the final months. They fought bravely and lost tens of thousands of people throughout the war, but in the final couple months, they didn't fight because they weren't willing to die for the Ghani administration. I mean, look at what Ambassador Samad said. Ghani's base is in Washington, D.C. I mean, at some point, Americans need to stop investing in leaders simply because they enjoy having coffee with them in Washington, D.C., and they find them to be charming people. This is the basis in some way, at some point, of the support for Ghani, which is ridiculous. And I think that was one of the problems. They didn't have a commander-in-chief. How can you have a military that doesn't have a commander-in-chief? These young Afghans are not willing to die for an administration that they knew was going to board private jets and leave if things became nasty. And I think the Taliban understood that, and they did fill that vacuum, a vacuum that could not permanently be filled by the United States, by the way. It couldn't be permanently filled by the United States. I agree with all the criticism of the Taliban. It appears that the Taliban have not learned the lessons of the last 20 years, and they don't have an intention to be inclusive about governance. And I really warn my American colleagues and Western colleagues not to fall for a photo op of them sitting with Karzai or Abdullah if they're not actually going to be genuinely inclusive. But at the end of the day, that's going to be a problem that can only be determined by Afghans.
Correct. Thank you so much. That was Adam Weinstein speaking with us. Ambassador Samad, the idea of, and you mentioned this, frankly, the idea that you can pick up Afghans, very bright Afghans, no doubt about that. not just public intellectuals, but internationally acclaimed intellectuals, Dr. Ghani being one of those. But politics as the aggregation of interests, and often conflicting and contradictory interests, require leaders that have roots in the soil. Is that something which you think the Taliban and others who are still there can provide? If we assume that Afghanistan is indeed moving towards a broad-based inclusive government, do you think the Taliban and those who are there on the ground can provide that kind of leadership?
Well, having roots is one factor, and it's an important factor. And we saw what happens when you don't have deep enough roots. The other factors obviously have to do with intention, political will, and ideology comes into play with the Taliban to a large extent, because they frame everything according to their interpretation of Sharia. And we are all waiting to see what happens. We are not seeing the right signs yet, and we are still waiting to hear from them as far as how open-minded and embracing they will be of others in Afghanistan. So it's a question of really understanding your country, your society. And if the Taliban haven't learned that lesson, as others have or haven't over the years, then they're going to face the same issues. Maybe not immediately, but down the road, they're going to face many issues. And the most immediate issue, obviously, not only has to do with governance, it also has to do with the economic and humanitarian state of the country right now. We are in crisis mode in so many ways. The fact that the flow of money and capital and investment has stopped, and that there's no more aid coming, a country that after all this amount, more than 2 trillion, almost 3 trillion, if you count other countries' expenditures and contributions to Afghanistan, we're talking to close to $3 trillion worth of money. But obviously not all of it came to Afghanistan. A tenth of it maybe ended up in Afghanistan. But even with a tenth, you look at the country today and you feel like nothing happened. Very little was done. Yes, we have some infrastructure. Yes, we have some improvement in progress in certain fields. But this should have been very different. So the Taliban have to deal with the economy now, and they have to deal with people's livelihoods. They have to make sure that the agricultural sector of Afghanistan gets back on its feet, that we deal with the daily challenges that individuals in the city and in rural Afghanistan face. It's not just about security. It's not just about trying to whip people to submission. It's so much more, and we are not in the 1990s. We are in a very different society with 70% of the population under the age of 30, with access to social media and what is happening in the world. And so I don't think we can go to a totalitarian system. And hopefully the Taliban have learned these lessons. And in the next few days, the burden is on them to prove to the rest of Afghanistan, to the region, and to the world that they have changed and that they are looking at things from a very different perspective.
Right. I'm going to take a short break, but I just wanted to add that the former governor of Afghanistan Central Bank, Ajmal Ahmadi, wrote a brilliant op-ed in the Financial Times, I think about a couple of weeks ago, in which he talked about the problem of money, the freezing of $9 million, Germany's $300 million of aid that Germany has suspended, and the SDR allocation by the IMF. And he then presented a scenario of where this is likely to lead. So I completely agree with Ambassador Samad that is one of the major challenges that the Taliban will face, in addition to aggregating those political interests that cut across multiple ethnic groups and tribes. In any case, we're going to talk about that after this short break and continue our assessment of America's gains and losses in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. We continue our discussion of America's longest war in Afghanistan. I still have with me Mr. Tariq Farhadi and Mr. Omar Samad. And I'm also joined by Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh, a former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan. Let's continue with what we were discussing. Let me pull in Mr. Farhadi here. So, Mr. Farhadi, the whole idea of inclusiveness and broad-based government. So some of the initial signs were good with reference to the Taliban. Sohail Shaheen in one of the interviews said that we're not going to go for these old and tried formulae that have failed, and we're not going to monopolize or centralize power. But the New York Times has this latest story by Matthew Akins, which talks about the possibility of the Taliban announcing some kind of setup with Hibatullah Akhundzada as the supreme leader, something along the lines of the Iranian system, and then, Mullah Baradar being the head of government and so on. If that happens, then that means they're either not talking to others, or after forming the central core, that they will begin to talk to someone. What is your assessment of that?
I think the pictures that we saw with the political leaders were just pictures, and there weren't any in-depth discussion. So now they are going to come up with their central core. But if they come up with a central core that does not include the others, the world is not going to recognize them. They are going to, again, be the Taliban of 1996 to 2001. But this time, Afghanistan needs help from the world. It needs humanitarian assistance. It needs its banking system to be connected to the rest of the world. Afghanistan is an importing country. It imports its food, medicine, fuel. And the Taliban are going to very quickly see that there is going to be discontent from the population, because the conditions for the majority of the Afghan polity is going to become difficult. On the other hand, if the Taliban, imagine, brought people like us or comparable to us inside Afghanistan, do they have the capacity to deal with other ideas, or they want to impose one way of governing? I wish to no country in the world that a group comes in and imposes one way of governing, and they don't come through elections. They come through force. So people are stuck with the situation. But in fact, I predict that if they don't bring other figures, women, and garner the acceptability of the international community, resistance is going to form against the Taliban. And this resistance will not be in Panjshir. It'll be in Kabul.
Yes. Now here's the thing, and this is an important point. So, Ambassador Samad also talked about it. You have just spoken about this. There are a number of challenges. So the easier, as a matter of fact, notwithstanding the resilience of nearly 20 years of insurgency, it would seem to be the easier part of it than actual governance. Now, you have already listed a number of challenges in terms of international recognition, the money coming in, and the tenuous balance with all the other ethnicities. And if that does not work out, you're absolutely right that there's going to be resistance. Now, my question to you is that Taliban did not really win militarily, in the sense that, except for Herat and Shebogan and a few other places, they just, they had these deals. People were not happy with the Ghani administration. A similar thing can happen to them. Do you think that after all this effort, they will not have the sense to realize that, they could sort of, they could be shooting themselves in the foot?
There is a risk that Taliban also miscalculate, thinking that the resistance, right now, people are a little bit dizzy. Everyone wants fighting to stop in Afghanistan. But there is a risk that they miscalculate and think that people have accepted them. People have not accepted them. We don't know the Taliban. The young people in Kabul are afraid of their fighters. Their fighters are not used to the Kabulis. There will be resistance, and they might not have enough people to fight. Even the Taliban, they might not have. They were fighting a corrupt government, a corrupt system. But if the genuine resistance starts, this will be a long-term fight. And for those who haven't given up their arms, because people are still armed in Afghanistan, they'll be fighting ahead.
The central hardcore sort of, the fighting core of the Taliban is about, estimated to be about 30 to 35,000 people. But those are very important points. Thank you so much. That was Tariq Farhadi speaking with us. Ambassador Samad, what is your sense of, Mr. Farhadi said that there could be a miscalculation. Do you think that the chances of a miscalculation are high because it will become difficult for the Taliban to juxtapose the pragmatism with the tenets of their ideology?
A lot depends on what's going on inside the Taliban. We don't have a clear window as to what is happening inside the organization and the different layers that forms this organization. They continue to be very successful in being very secretive. Look, they met in Kandahar this week, but we didn't have a photo of their spiritual leader. We only had a sort of a picture of the meeting where you couldn't figure out who was who.
They now have released one. Sorry, I was interjecting. The latest New York Times report that I was quoting, Matthew Aiken's, they have released one image of their supreme leader.
Okay, maybe they have released an image. That's called progress, I guess, relatively speaking. So we need to figure out also what are the different tendencies within the Taliban. We know that there is a hardcore, there is a soft underbelly maybe, and then there's the maybe mainstream Taliban. Who is calling the shots? How are they being influenced from within as well as from the outside? To what extent are they influenced from the outside? And so I think that will have quite an impact on the decisions that have to be made in the next few days. And you can tell that there is some tension within the Taliban. The fact that they are taking their time, knowing that we are in an emergency situation, knowing that the world is waiting to see what kind of decisions come out, and knowing that the rest of Afghanistan is in dire straits. So that's important. But you see, I think that this is where I want to just point to the important role that the region and countries like Pakistan and China and Russia and the Central Asians and Iran can play. Obviously, others beyond our neighborhood also have a role, like Qatar and Turkey and India maybe. But overall, the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan also, most of them have their embassies still open in Kabul, and they are not going to shut down at any moment. Recognition is a different issue. When and under what circumstances each country recognizes the Taliban or the new government is going to be discussed in the next few days once they make their announcement. But I think that it's important that the region send the right signals, which they have, but they need to be orchestrated in a way that the Taliban understand that isolation is not an option. Not only being isolated from the West and the international community and the UN system, for example,
but also from the region. But also from the region. Yes. That's a very important point. And on this point, let's bring Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh into this discussion. Ambassador Sheikh, you heard Ambassador Samad talk about the role that the regional countries can play. Now, Pakistan seems to have been taking the lead in that. And, we got the Chinese in, Mullah Baradar, as you know, met with the Chinese foreign minister, China's foreign minister, Wang Yi. The Russians are also in on this play. The foreign minister Qureshi just returned from a four-nation tour. And then yesterday, the German foreign minister was here, and we talked about the inclusive broad-based government. So give me a sense of how much influence Pakistan can wield with reference to what we think is the right way for the Taliban to go.
Well, let me start by saying that I think Ambassador Samad and your other participants have made the point that that the Taliban can't be, in essence, that what they are saying is not necessarily what is going to happen. I am somewhat more optimistic on that score. I think that what they have done so far is to try and build a national reconciliation. They have not, they've shut off routes to Panjshir, but they have not attacked Panjshir. Instead, they've started negotiations, and those negotiations are
there were some clashes yesterday. There were some clashes yesterday. Apparently, it was a sort of a military patrol or something that came under fire. So there have been some casualties. But yes, you're right. I mean, the talks are also going on.
On the whole, let us be clear that on the whole, the Taliban have acted with restraint. They have not. They are still talking to Masood, and I think that the point Masood has made is that we will not support any fundamentalist government. That is a point that I think the Taliban are prepared to concede or are prepared to make part of their own program. So I have an idea that on that particular score, the Taliban are proceeding with patience and with this particular objective. I think that there will be national reconciliation, that with Panjshir and with other centers of opposition such as exist. I have seen, I must confess, that my reading of what is happening so far has not shown that they have really done what Carlota Gal in her article has talked about as being reports from Human Rights Watch, etc. These are not really authenticated reports by my reckoning. Now, it's obvious that I'm talking from a very different perspective and from a very different point of view in terms of the fact that I don't have the same resources to check on what is happening that other more knowledgeable people do. But what comes through to me is that so far the Taliban have resisted the use of military force to try and impose their rule. So far, they are still thinking in terms of reconciliation. Now, is that reconciliation going to be broad-based, or is it going to be only limited? Now, we just now we talked about the fact, or our commentators talked about the fact that, look, Afghanistan is a very different society. It isn't. We are fooling ourselves. For the most part, the Afghan society is deeply conservative. This conservative ism is part of the Afghan makeup, which covers not only the rural areas, but also many of the people who have migrated from the rural areas to the urban areas. Their outlook remains the same as it was. So, and particularly with regard to the status of women.
Okay. I interject here, Ambassador Sheikh. I want to pull in Ambassador Samad quickly because he has another commitment also. Ambassador Samad, is there any comment you want to make with reference to what Ambassador Sheikh has said? That's he's more optimistic and he thinks that there's going to be reconciliation, and so far the signals by the Taliban have been more or less okay.
Listen, we all want to be optimistic, and let me just tell you what just came through the wires, that Mr. Abbas Tonigzai, the Talib representative and spokesperson, has told the BBC that the new government will be announced within 2 days. He also said that women will have a role, but not at the ministerial level, and that also they will not have anyone in the government at the higher levels who has worked in the past for the US-backed government. So we have now a bit more clarity on some of the criteria that they have in mind. The reaction to this, obviously, is probably going to be negative in some quarters, somewhat optimistic and positive in some other quarters. But it shows that the Taliban have changed a bit they're a bit more accommodating. They understand that women have a role to play, and they understand that they need technocrats and educated people to help them run the government. But they are not willing to share power in a way that some people think is more practical in Afghanistan today. They seem to want to have, obviously, control. They see themselves as victorious, and they seem to want to have the monopoly of power in their own hands within their own ranks at the higher levels.
Okay, that's a very interesting thing, and I'm happy you shared this on the program. But could I offer another theory and see if you might, agree with that? That perhaps there are, as you mentioned yourself also, it's been a polycentric organization in many ways. So there are different ideological strains, and perhaps they don't want to sort of, go against the ideological mindset of their hardcore fighters and also / leaders. So they're just kind of, opening the window a little bit to see how that works out. Is that, would you agree with that thesis?
Yes, as I had mentioned earlier, you're right. They first and foremost have to make sure that they maintain cohesiveness within their own ranks. That is critical to them because the Taliban are a diverse group of people fighting for some issues that they have in common, and then they differ on the drivers that have helped them reach this point. So internal cohesiveness is important. At the same time, they realize that they have to show the world and the Afghan people that they are not the Taliban of the 1990s. But at the same time, it does mean that they want to have control over the levels of the state and government.
It's going to be a tightrope walk for them, and I suspect we'll have more occasion to discuss what happens next. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Omar Samad speaking with us. Ambassador Sheikh, you heard the latest. Does that offer more optimism, or does that dent the optimism?
Enables me to be more optimistic because it shows that they are, look, it's very simple to say that there are divisions within the Taliban. I have no doubt that there are divisions. But at the moment, the people who are talking on behalf of the Taliban and who I think are able to exert a degree of control over the Taliban are talking about a society which is deeply conservative. I mean, I'm repeating the point that you may talk about the fact that Kabul is very different from the, or parts of Kandahar or Mazar Sharif are very different from what they were in. But essentially, it is the migrant from the villages which is coming in and has come in without abandoning their deeply conservative beliefs.
So it seems to me that the point that you're making is that the Taliban ideology with reference to, what we talk about rights and so on and so forth is not very different from the society, by and large, especially the countryside, but also, as you said, migrants to the urban centers.
That's exactly right. We have sort of been enchanted by the fact that there has been so much change in Afghanistan. Actually, there hasn't been all that much change. You cannot change a society merely by the fact that the urban population has grown, but the urban population has grown by way of migration from the rural centers, and from the rural centers they brought with them the same conservative beliefs that they had earlier.
I think that's a very important. I'm sorry. I mean, I've just run out of time, but that's a very important point, and I think the litmus test, if you would agree, would be how people react to whatever the new setup is going to be. But thank you so much. That was Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.